A letter to an old friend. It's been some time since we last checked in. Reflective I've been, remembering when as kids we agreed to an avoidance list. How ridiculous. Awkward adolescence, I guess. Religion and politics. And we stuck to it, never discussing this. But get this, I can now see and I think you were blinded by your learned theology, God-fearing only in appearance, overlooking the lived experience, failing to see the divine imagery in others, he, she, they, we, even me. I remember you once said you loved our friends Ivan and Fred, that you had no problem with their, quote, lifestyle that they led. But you had the audacity to truly state that they could never truly enter St. Peter's gates. Your words so fully masked in hate, my friend, that there's the real sin. And you voted for them again? Pushers of propaganda, paranoia, and basic human rights denied simply because of the color of someone's skin? Such sin. Have you forgotten your propia familia's origin? Perdóname, amiga. I'm just venting. Your father crossed the Rio Grande without a plan, holding your grandmother's hand, and I'm writing and watching and seeing on your Instagram to the way you dismissed these same kids with a similar wish as what your family once cherished. I don't get it. Did you forget when we were kids, we pinky swore? Though the truth seems to matter more, as I age, I soar, I roar against injustice, no longer able to stand aside watching this. You've questioned my influences while still making excuses for ancient institutions. Your heart once upon a time shined, beamed with pride, and now it seems you've chosen to hide, blending into the crowd, no longer standing for what is right, but more for what's, well, good night.
We don't talk about sin much anymore. For the most part, I don't miss it. Who wants to be told that we're sinful or depraved, that we've committed transgressions or an iniquity, whatever that means? It brings to mind Bible-thumping, judgment-casting condemnation from old white men with beards pounding on the pulpit. I don't think that works for anyone anymore, not even old white men with beards. But just because we don't talk about sin anymore, doesn't mean that sin is gone. Sin is just a word that carries a lot of baggage. Original sin? That's even worse. That ancient Christian doctrine, original sin, it has some dubious origins. Augustine of Hippo was the main author and champion of the doctrine. Everyone in that day knew that the original sin was related to Adam and Eve's disobedience in the garden with eating the fruit. But Augustine equated original sin with sex. He came to understand sin through his own personal struggle of controlling his sexual desire. And his understanding of biology was reflected in the lack of scientific data available at his time. These two things combined for his understanding of sin. Now, this is where I give you TMI, so be warned. Augustine believed that Adam held all of humanity in his semen. Literally. Eve, and women in general, had nothing to do with childbearing except being a container. And because all of humanity was in Adam's semen, all of humanity was infected with Adam's original sin. That is why the early Christians believed that infants are born sinful. Now, as a mother who has held two beautiful and perfect little human beings moments after I'd just given birth to them, I'd like to disagree. People throughout Christian history have considered whether or not the doctrine of original sin was still relevant. The conclusion? Yes. And there is still value in the doctrine. That is because at its very basic level, the doctrine of original sin asserts that all of humanity are born into situations without their consent that implicate them in acts of sinfulness. Let me say that again. Original sin asserts that all of humanity is born into situations without their consent that implicate them in acts of sinfulness. Can you hear in this statement the connection between an individual and the world into which they are born, the society, the cultural norms, the institutions? Consider children born in the South during the 17th and 18th century. Some were white, born into a family that lived on a plantation and bought and sold black people who were enslaved. It was culturally accepted, normalized. Now, it's easy to say slavery is a sin, but back then, that was not the prevalent idea or belief. Institutions can create a magnified expression of individual sin. Institutions, through the cooperation of individuals, create a power greater than the individuals and perpetuate, normalize, and sustain the sin committed through them. And children raised in a culture with institutions that are sinful have no choice as to whether or not they participate. That is, until they do. There is a moment when we all learn about the true nature of our institutions, the way in which some institutions cause harm to one group and benefit to another. We become aware, and in that moment, we have a choice. If we stand against that sinfulness, then we reject sin. But if we do not, then that is the moment when our ancestors' sins become our own. When original sin with a capital O and a capital S becomes your sin and my sin. When we think about all of the isms that affect our communal life together, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, all the rest, those isms and the harm they cause are far too pervasive and ingrained to be understood simply by individual actions. We know that, but we also often say, it wasn't me who owned slaves. If we do not understand and own our participation in institutions that cause harm, that are sinful, then we will never understand our agency within them, our power that we have to change those institutions. Institutions are stubborn, to be sure, but just as the evil that institutions cause is stronger than the individual act, so too is the good that is done by individuals coming together to do good. Together, we create a power that is stronger than any one of us alone. For many theologians, that power that flows between people in acts of goodness is God. Recognize your sin and embrace your power.